She's written many publications during the years and received multiple honors and awards, such as the first place in Brazil's Ministry of Foreign Affairs International Competition for the best work on Graciliano Ramos in 2009. Today, the lecture that she'll be talking about is under the topic, Good Neighbor Cultural Diplomacy in World War II, the Art of Making Friends. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a very, very warm welcome for Dr. Darlene J. Sadlier.
Thank you, Mark. I just want to say that this is a very small piece from a book that will be coming out shortly called Americans All, Good Neighbor Diplomacy in World War II. So if the topic interests you, I can give you a bit more information. I'm only focusing on just a very small aspect of a much larger cultural initiative, which has to do with art. But I talk about many other things in the book. In August 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt named Nelson A. Rockefeller to head the Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs. Now I'm going to abbreviate that with CIAA. No, it's not the CIA, but the CIAA. This was a new federal agency whose main objective was to strengthen cultural and commercial relations between the U.S. and Latin America in order to route Axis influence in countries like Brazil and secure a hemispheric solidarity. Rockefeller hired many of his friends who were among the nation's major business executives, as well as university officials, Pulitzer Prize winners, and well-known artists to work for the agency, which was organized in divisions of radio, motion pictures, press and publications, and an umbrella division dedicated to fostering the arts, building libraries, and providing educational training. The CIAA was the US government's first major investment in culture as a means not only to make friends abroad, but also to influence the public at home. The agency was not without its problems, yet the CIAA years have no equivalent in the history of US public diplomacy. It was the high point of US and Latin American alliances, known as the Good Neighbor, and has never been duplicated since. My paper today focuses on the CIAA's mission to forge strong diplomatic ties in the Americas through the arts, an area of special interest to Nelson Rockefeller, who was an arts patron and member of the board of the Museum of Modern Art, which was founded by his mother, Abby, in the 1920s. And I'll be saying MoMA. MoMA is the Museum of Modern Art. So. Rockefeller relied on the MoMA and museums nationwide to create a hemispheric dialogue based on the arts. It was the first time in US history that artists played a significant role in public policy. Just months after its inception, the CIAA received written approval for 26 special projects at a cost of nearly $500,000. The most expensive, at $150,000, was an inter-American exhibit of art and culture under the direction of the MoMA, to be held simultaneously with parallel exhibits in capital cities throughout the Americas. 255 US paintings were curated by the MoMA in conjunction with other major museums, and in April 1941, the exhibit was previewed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Portions of the large exhibit then toured 8 South American republics, Mexico and Cuba, for close to a year, beginning with an exposition at Mexico City's Palacio de Bellas Artes in June 1941. The emphasis was on modern art and included paintings by George O'Keeffe, Thomas Hart Benton, Edward Hopper, Stuart Davis, Lauren MacIver, and Eugene Speichler, among others. A file in the MoMA archives has valuations of all the paintings at the time, the highest value being George Bellow's Dempsey and Firpo, and George O'Keeffe's The White Flower at $25,000 each. An Edward Hopper watercolor titled Box Factory Gloucester was valued at $400, and Arthur Dove's Electric Peach Orchard at $250. I need hardly say that all these items have accrued great value in subsequent years. U.S. specialists accompanied the various tours. MoMA's executive Stanton Payton went to Mexico City, to Quito, Lima, and Santiago. New Orleans artist Caroline J, who had lived in Mexico and worked with Diego Rivera and other muralists there, oversaw exhibits in Buenos Aires, Rio, and Montevideo. And Lewis Riley, who had studied art and archaeology and lived in Central America for nearly a decade, traveled to Havana, Caracas, and Bogota. The ambitious project was successful in introducing a little-known aspect of U.S. culture to the other American republics. Caroline Durieux was enthusiastic about the South American reception, stating in a newspaper interview that over 60,000 people had attended the 3 capital city exhibits. In good neighbor fashion, which tried to emphasize the sameness of peoples north and south, she also spoke of fundamental similarities between the Americas that should outweigh any differences. But she seemed to put emphasis on race. She said, there is a definite kinship between North and South Americans who, after all, have sprung from the same European stock, and there is no reason why misunderstandings should exist between them, end quote. She was particularly pleased that Latin Americans, quote, were learning that there is more to the United States than business, end quote, a recurring slogan in cultural relations. The CIAA project included the publication and distribution of 35,000 trilingual exhibit catalogs titled Contemporary Painting in the U.S., with a preface by novelist Waldo Frank, who was a major proponent of Latin American literature and culture in the United States. Total attendance for the exhibitions abroad was around 220,000. Press reaction was very positive and widespread, including favorable reviews by 2 of Brazil's most celebrated authors, José Lins do Rego, who was a novelist, well-known novelist at the time, and well-known poet Manuel Bandeira. Meanwhile, an amusing anecdote about the exhibit appeared in the U.S. newspapers. Among the paintings on display was Eugene Speichler's portrait of Broadway star Katharine Cornell in the role of Bernard Shaw's Candida, a painting that Cornell had donated to the MoMA. Suddenly, Cornell began receiving fan mail from South America and South Americans who had seen the exhibit and praised her extraordinary beauty in their letters. Intrigued by this outpouring, Cornell obtained a catalog of the show and discovered that two of the artwork titles had been switched. Cornell as Candida had been transposed to one of Speicher's voluptuous nudes. The second part of the Inter-American project involved an exhibition of Latin American works to be loaned by various U.S. art museums, private companies, and institutions, including the MoMA, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the Pan American Union. The San Francisco Museum of Art was one of the most heavily invested, with paintings, drawings, and photographs valued at $10,000. These monetary sums seem very small to us today, but in 1940, these were fairly high prices. Among the artists selected by the San Francisco Museum were Mexicans Rufino Tamayo, Diego Rivera, Jose Clemente Orozco, David Alfaro Siqueiros, and Fermin Revueltas, Brazilian Cândido Portinari, Colombian Luis Alberto Acuña, Peruvian Julia Codecido, and Cubans Wilfredo Lam and Amelia Velas. An April 20th, 1942 document from the San Francisco Museum to the MoMA includes a list of titles and artists as well as photographs of their artwork loaned for this exhibit. Overall, there is stylistic variety, but there are also recurring images and motifs. Unlike the parallel exhibit of U.S. modern art, the overwhelming focus of the Latin American exhibit is on representations of indigenous peasant culture, with images of women and children as primary subjects. Most landscapes were also rural. The Argentine Onofrio Pacienza's Marine is the only painting of a seashore. Rufino Tamayo's surrealistic The Window is perhaps the most artistically daring and unusual of the canvases, with its serene moonlight and menacing revolver. An identified Argentine painting of factory workers and smokestacks is one of the few to depict the urban working class or to evoke social realist aesthetics. In fact, the San Francisco Museum selections did very little to suggest to North American viewers that Latin America was modern, except in regard to certain stylistic approaches. Because the CIA was preoccupied with touting all of the American republics as modern, as well as largely white and middle class, the agency added modernistic poster art to the exhibit. It also contracted art photographers to produce images of urban architecture, city centers, and the Latin middle class. Among these were selections from filmmaker Julian Bryan's photographic series, People of Pan America. One of the dividends from the Inter-American Art Project was an exhibit at the Toledo, Ohio Museum of Art. This was in the United States in March 1942, which was publicized as the first major show of Chilean art in North America. The exhibit was a goodwill gesture arranged by the Chilean government in appreciation for the U.S. show and the visit by Toledo's Museum of Art director, who was sent to Chile by the CIA to report on the status of contemporary Chilean art. So this was a nice inter-American gesture. A news story dated April 16, 1942, reported that over 12,000 people had seen the more than 150 artworks displayed during the first 2 weeks, and that the exhibit would tour the U.S. with a final stop at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The story made much of the fact that with the Americas cut off from Europe by the war, the 21 republics were now in the process of discovering one another through museum exhibitions. Museums were not the only venue for good neighbor art. Several different South American countries loaned artwork to Macy's department store in New York, which were later displayed in other stores in the U.S. The size of the Macy's exhibit was impressive, with a loan of 43 paintings and 13 sculptures from Colombia alone. Railway stations, libraries, and city halls were also used for informational exhibits, such as the Americas Cooperate, which was a large photographic display in which vital wartime materials from Latin America, including copper, manganese, and mercury, were artfully displayed. As a result of CIA initiatives, certain Latin American artists quickly came to the attention of critics, and markets for their works grew in the United States. Already in late 1940, Brazilian Cândido Portinari was on the rise in art circles as a result of his larger-than-life modernist murals of Brazilian Northeasterners. These were fishermen, baianas, and gauchos, who were displayed in the acclaimed Brazilian Pavilion at New York's 1939 World Fair. This pavilion was a sensation because it was designed by Oscar Niemeyer, and if you know anything about architecture, you know that Niemeyer was the architect who designed the capital city, Brasilia, in Brazil, as well as, he's still living, he's over 100 years old, but in many important buildings around the world. During his stay in the United States for the World Fair, Portinari was commissioned to paint numerous portraits, including a self-portrait for Nelson Rockefeller and 4 portraits of the Arthur Rubinstein family. In November 1940, poet and Library of Congress director Archibald MacLeish invited Portinari to paint a set of murals for the Library of Congress's Hispanic reading room. As a good neighbor gesture, the Brazilian government paid for Portinari to come back to the United States, and the CIA matched Brazil's funds to support the artist's work. Once sketches were completed, Portinari began painting the murals in October 1941 and finished 2 months later. Like other muralists at the time, Portinari was drawn to the rural poor and urban working class as inspiration for his work. His World Fair murals also depicted Brazil's 3 races through modernist-style figures of men and women. Although the Brazilian government under dictator Getúlio Vargas wanted to promote Brazil's modernity and put limits on images of Brazil as poor, black, or mixed race, Portinari continued to celebrate the nation's racial heritage in his floor-to-ceiling paintings for the Library of Congress. The murals focused on the most humble social types: Portuguese sailors on a ship bound for Brazil, mixed-race Sao Paulo frontiersmen pushing into the interior to seize land for the crown and capture fugitive Indian slaves, Portuguese Jesuits converting Indian women and children, and African slaves being transported during the 18th century gold rush to the Minas Gerais interior. The Library of Congress murals were well received at the official opening on January 12, 1942, where a specially produced publication called the Portinari Murals celebrated the artwork as a step forward in U.S.-Brazilian cultural relations. In spring 1942, Brazil's Ministry for Education reciprocated by inviting U.S. artist George Biddle to teach a course at the newly created technical school in Rio de Janeiro. Biddle had been heavily influenced by Diego Rivera and the Mexican muralist tradition and was a central proponent of the Federal Arts Project under Roosevelt, his first mural having appeared in 1933's Chicago World's Fair. He later chaired the U.S. War Department's Art Advisory Committee and wrote the book Artist at War about his experiences as art war correspondent for Life magazine in North Africa and Sicily. Biddle and his sculptor wife, Elaine Sardou, were invited to create 2 murals in fresco and bas-relief for Rio's National Library. Biddle wrote enthusiastically, quote, "I feel very happy now the way things have turned out. The 2 large murals are in as fine a building as any in Rio, on the main avenue of the city, and the themes which I intend to use have, I believe, great significance. 1, not hatred, destruction, and death over America, but 2, intelligence and humanity shall rule our world. As far as I know, it's the first time that 2 artists from the States have been invited by a South American government to execute an important mural commission." Biddle's social activism and horror of war, if wedded with his various experiences as a teacher and artist in Brazil, led him to draft a document advising the CIAA to convene a Congress of Latin American and U.S. artists and writers in the United States. He compared Western Europe's long-standing program of cultural relations with Latin America with the U.S. historic and lamentable indifference to cultural exchange. He wrote, "Over and over again in a year's stay in Brazil, I saw tragic evidence of the lack of such a program. Commenting on the situation, a Brazilian publisher and editor said to me, 'You are 30 years late at the start, but for these next few months, you are without competition.'" He's talking about the US. "For God's sakes, do something now. After the war, it may be too late. At any rate, you will no longer be in a position where you can shape an intelligent cultural program for an eager and friendly audience of 120 million, end quote. Biddle recommended to the CIA broader, more comprehensive actions such as discussions over copyright laws to protect artists and writers, federal programs to support the arts, literature, and theater, laws to preserve historical monuments and art objects, and ways to address common educational problems and goals. His most detailed recommendation involved CIA sponsorship of a U.S. visit by 50 Latin American artists and writers at an estimated $70,000, a figure that he deemed a bargain in terms of goodwill and intellectual dividends, and a scant amount compared to a December 1942 article that ran in the New York Times that reported $46 billion had already been spent to date on the war effort. Along with the Latin American and U.S. art exhibits, the CIA sponsored a South American tour by sculptor Joe Davidson, who was commissioned in the spring of 1941 to create bronze busts of 10 Latin American presidents. Davidson received especially long and favorable newspaper coverage while he was working in Montevideo and Caracas. In June 1942, this is the Biddle mural in Rio, and the bas-relief of his wife in the same place. In 1942, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. hosted an exhibition of Davidson's work accompanied by a catalog of presidents of the South American republics. The CIA's Good Neighbor agenda was in the forefront of the museum's mind when it placed Davidson's earlier bust of Roosevelt alongside those of the Latin American leaders. No expense seems to have been spared. The CIA gave the busts to the Latin American presidents and their families and dispatched hundreds of catalogs in Spanish and Portuguese for distribution throughout U.S. embassies in South America. Davidson is just one example of an artist whose life was radically changed by his wartime assignments. Writing to U.S. Ambassador to Chile, Claude Bowers in August '44, he reminisced about his South American tour and referred excitedly to his chairmanship of the high-profile Committee of Artists, Writers, and Scientists for the re-election of Franklin Roosevelt. He wrote, "This is the first time in my life where I've taken any active part in a political campaign, but I feel it's so that I simply had to do it." End quote. That sentiment was echoed by hundreds of CIA contracted artists, filmmakers, and writers who, perhaps for the very first time, felt the culture was a recognizable and integral part of U.S. foreign diplomacy. Unfortunately, the end of World War II and the advent of the Cold War brought a close to the CIAA, an agency that achieved more than any other agency then or now in terms of U.S.-Latin American relations. Cultural diplomacy in general was under scrutiny because of its association with the liberalism of Roosevelt's New Deal, or in the words of President Harry Truman's Assistant Secretary for Latin America, as those do-gooders and one-worlders and communist fellow travelers, the latter term intended as a specific reference to the CIAA. Cultural programs were now the purview of the State Department, which in 1950 was attacked by Joseph McCarthy's House Un-American Activities Committee and the FBI, attack by them on former CIA supporters, including the former Library of Congress head Archibald MacLeish, filmmaker Orson Welles, and former Rockefeller CIA advisor William Benton, who was now a U.S. Senator from Connecticut. Archibald MacLeish was singled out by McCarthy and by J. Edgar Hoover for his communist associations. His bemused response was, "No one would be more shocked to learn I am a communist than the communists themselves." Orson Welles was secretly and officially listed by the FBI as a threat to the internal security of the United States. During the period of the Hollywood blacklist, he was given few opportunities, and as a result, he became a European exile for nearly a decade. William Benton's criticism of McCarthy's vituperative and unsubstantiated attacks against State Department officials and his formal call for McCarthy's expulsion from the Senate resulted in similar attacks against him and U.S. cultural programs in general. According to historian Frank Nikovich, monies that had been appropriated for the CIA needed to be spent prior to June 30th, 1946. The State Department's J. Leroy Davidson used these unspent funds to purchase 79 contemporary oil paintings by figures such as George O'Keeffe, Stuart Davis, Walter Roper, and Marsden Hartley at the extraordinary and total low price of $49,000, which was the result of negotiations with artists who agreed to sell under market value as a patriotic gesture. Like the CIA's earliest touring exhibits on U.S. and Latin American art, the State Department's emphasis was on modern art and its association with progress and modernity. The purchase was also in keeping with the idea of offering cultural media directed specifically at the upper and ruling class. The paintings were displayed in New York under the exhibition title Advancing American Art, which was already a sign of changing attitudes. Formerly used to describe the good neighbor community of 21 republics, American was now being used to describe only the U.S. After a favorable reception in New York, the exhibit Advancing American Art was shipped to a UNESCO International Art Exhibit in Paris in October 1946, where it received glowing reviews. The collection was later split into two touring exhibits, one for Europe and the other for Latin America. But a cultural backlash began when the February 18, 1947 issue of the popular magazine called Look featured an illustrated article on the collection headed, and the article was called, "Your Money Bought These Pictures." Denunciations from Hearst-owned newspapers and Republican Party leaders soon followed, accusing the State Department of pushing a left-wing agenda through the purchase and display of art that subverted the American way of life. President Harry Truman agreed when he publicly stated, "If this is art, then I'm a Hottentot." And he stood with political conservatives who considered representational art to be the only acceptable forum for US cultural exchange. An idea that was ironically similar to Nazi attitudes towards degenerate modernism. In the meantime, the relationship with Latin America oscillated between indifference, frostiness, and intervention with the rise of Cold War rhetoric. As the US works towards better cultural relations with Brazil and Latin America, as well as other regions today, it might look back to the years of the CIAA as, at least in some ways, a model and primer for the art of making friends. Good neighbor cultural diplomacy was by no means perfect. It was willing to overlook or placate anti-democratic governments in certain countries, and it insisted too much on sameness between the US and Latin America. But it was also a genuinely progressive cultural and educational undertaking that taught people about one another and made friends through art. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sadlier, for your very, very informative lecture. As usual, we have a question and answer session. So, questions, please.
The question I have, because I haven't seen both of the collection of art that were exchanged on either side, and oftentimes when you're curating a show or an exhibition, there's definitely a very strong idea that you are presenting by taking very separate works and putting them under one sort of heading or one idea. And I thought it was really interesting, the idea of the show that was called, Advancing American Art, and we're really thinking about these things as an advancement of America and the American identity in both North and South America. The question is, though, what was sort of the message and the way this art was received on both sides of that equation? Was the art that was brought up from Latin America to North America, did that also have a different sort of message to it than that was just going the other direction? Also thinking about, possibly there was also this message of primitivism or, like simplification in the art techniques and just because you've seen it, what was your response to that?
Well, obviously, these exhibits were ephemeral, so you can get a sense of a few things. It's very difficult to see what the whole collection was like. For example, the Chilean exhibit, there's no record of what was in that. I think what's interesting is the fact that the agency, the CIAA, their notion of good neighbors relied a lot. They debated for a long time about what is it that we want to promote? What do we want to say about the U.S.? What do we want to say culturally about the U.S.? And so their interest was in promoting the idea of the U.S. as modern, as progressive, as middle class, and as white. Okay? And the art that was sent to Latin America tended to reinforce those concepts. Latin American, one of the interesting things is a lot of people feel that, well, this was just all sent to them. There was no reciprocal action. But Latin American leaders also had the ability to select what they wished to send to the United States. And not surprisingly, if we think about Brazil, Candy de Portinari was sort of an example aside. But what they were sending up was also art that represented Brazil, let's say, as modern, as progressive, as white, which was silly, but problematic, and middle class, which was also not the case. Of course, middle class, the images of the middle class would be sent to Latin America with something like we would associate with Charlottenburg here. The kind of houses that you see in, I don't know if you've been to Charlottenburg, but I mean, it's just massive sort of mansions right one next to the other. And a lot of the artwork, photographs and things like that came from Latin America also showed or tried to give the sense that Brazilians or Colombians or Chileans also had a similar lifestyle. So the idea was, the emphasis was on sameness. Whether or not that was the case in either country, in any of the countries, was put aside. But that's the image that they wanted to promote. with art going down, and for Latin Americans, there are exhibits coming up. But like I said, the one art exhibit that was created in the U.S. that put together some Latin American artwork that was in the U.S., the CIA had problems with it because it showed Latin America as a rural, poor, mother-child images, and they added to that, paintings and photographs that showed it to be more modern.
You mentioned that after post-World War II, the cultural programs became sort of blacklisted, the Cold War kind of agenda, and that they saw them as a push for a left-wing agenda. So do you think that that kind of image is still filtering through the U.S. in regards to art of the other, or
how to answer that? I guess one could say that at least in the immediate post-war, you still had some exhibits going out of the country. The fact that Truman and Look magazine criticized them as being,
liberal?
less than art. Well, less than art.
Right.
Being something, as I said, degenerate. At least there was something going out there. I don't know about that today. I really don't. I think this was a unique moment in U.S. history with regard to culture as a let's say a tool in cultural in the whole foreign diplomacy program. But once the war was over, and remember that a lot of the artists that were associated with this were left liberal.
Sure.
If
most artists.
Not far left, like somebody like Wells. So that once Truman came in, and once the Republicans became more of a force, and once McCarthy created his little committee, things went downhill fairly quickly. And all those CIA people were pretty much pushed aside or blacklisted or had problems.
Thank you. Any other questions? No? If not, there's not many of us here, so I'd like you to give Dr. Sadlier as big as applause as we can manage.